Originally, this video was going to be a response video to a video that was making the rounds by a user named Mad Blender about fascism being capitalism in decay. But 10 minutes into the video, and overwhelmed by so much baseless opinion and regurgitation of misnomers of fascism you learn in public school, I had the sudden urge to take the hater's advice and finally follow my leader. So I quickly turned off the video of a bougie neoliberal cosplaying a socialist and figured I would just help out and frame the argument myself by using what other internet leftists have said. So let's first address what fascism is. I hate that it's a topic that repeatedly comes up, but obviously there's so much ignorance on the topic. This is why, once again, you'll have people on the right accusing people on the left of being fascists.
Leftists can't acknowledge their man Gentile because that would undermine their attempt to bind conservatism to fascism. Conservatism wants small government so that individual liberty can flourish. The left, like Gentile, wants the opposite, to place the resources of the individual and industry in the service of a centralized state. To acknowledge Gentile is to acknowledge that fascism bears a deep kinship to the ideology of today's left.
And vice versa.
I'll ask you about different leaders. Is Pinochet a fascist?
No, Pinochet's not a fascist, no.
Okay. What about in Singapore? I've heard people say that Lee Kuan Yew is a fascist. Is he a fascist?
No, I wouldn't call him a fascist. There's to both these people, there is third position elements to their political philosophy. But yeah, no, I wouldn't say he was a third positionist in itself.
Now, what about Bolsonaro in Brazil? Is he a fascist?
No. Yeah, he's like a Trump. No, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I'm curious. Now, what about Rios Montt in Guatemala? Was he a fascist?
I'm not familiar with him, so I couldn't tell you, yeah.
Okay. What about the current president in Bolivia who was just installed by the United States? Is she a fascist?
No, she's not a fascist. Not at all.
Okay, so who in the world would you consider to be fascist?
Today? Nobody. Me. I mean, it's...
Okay.
When in reality, anyone who is actually a fascist is not going to shirk away from the title. It's a badge of pride. So this whole game of the right calling the left fascist and the left calling any kind of authoritarianism fascism, and then both sides denying it, meanwhile both of them not having the slightest clue as to what third position in fascism is. As to what fascism is, there will be links in the description, some shorter explanations and some much more detailed ones. But I would highly suggest anyone who especially hates fascism should at least know what it is that they hate. So I would encourage going through the links and getting some clarity on the subject that you're not going to find on your television or in your public school or in your university classes or anywhere else for that matter. Okay, so let's get on to the argument, the claim. Fascism is capitalism in decay. Where did this come from? Well, there seems to be confusion on its origin.
Fascism is capitalism in decay. You may have heard that quote already, but what does it mean? And who said it? That seems like an easy question because the entire internet seems to be sure that it was the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Lenin who said that, but it's not quite true. I spent more time than I should have trying to find a source on this, but there doesn't seem to be one. From this I conclude that it wasn't Lenin who said it, but someone evidently did, so we'll go with it. I guess our first lesson today is don't claim Lenin said this.
Okay, let's go to the book, Mussolini's Intellectuals by A. James Gregor, for the origin of the concept that fascism is capitalism in decay. By the time of fascism's ascension to power on the peninsula, Marxists of all kinds and their fellow travelers were desperately searching for the key to the understanding of the complex events that had overtaken them. Ahistoric and counter-revolutionary elements had somehow succeeded in overwhelming Marxism and political progressivism that had been commissioned by history to transform the world. It was at that juncture that Clara Zetkin affirmed that Mussolini's success was not the simple consequence of military victory. It was an ideological and political victory over the working class movement. That did not mean in the least that fascism employed an ideology that enjoyed superiority over that of Marxism, what it meant was that Marxists had not employed inherited theory to best advantage. Prior to its victory, Marxists had not understood the essence of fascism. Once understood, there was an aggressive effort among members of the Third Internationale to formulate a convincing account of Italian fascism to better counteract its toxin. Unfortunately, there was never to be any consistency among the Marxist assessments. Marxist theoreticians settled on only one consistency. Fascism was deemed counter-revolutionary, opposed to the course of history. So disposed, fascism had to be necessarily irrational, and, as irrational, contradictory. Other than that, Marxists were to characterize fascism in any number of overlapping and sometimes mutually exclusive fashion. At first, it was seen as a rural, agrarian reaction, in the service of those possessed of extensive land holdings. Then it was understood to be enlisted in the service of the urban middle classes. Then it was envisioned the creature of industrialists. Then it was conceived the instrument of finance capitalists. Some even attempted to portray fascism as the tool of all such interests in all their complexity. By the mid-1930s, most of the proffered Marxist interpretations of fascism had become standardized under the weight of Stalinist orthodoxy. Fascism was the creature and tool of finance capitalism, struggling to survive during the end days of the final crisis of capitalism. As capitalism sank into its inevitable and irreversible decline, fascism was compelled to ratchet down the nation's productive process in the effort to sustain monopoly price levels. So the concept coming out of the Third Internationale, when the Marxists were struggling with the reality of why fascism was beating them in the streets, why fascism was beating them at the ballot box, and why fascism took power in places like Italy and Germany. So now that we know the history of where the claim comes from of fascism is capitalism and decay, let us, before we get into the facts that may or may not support that claim, let's get into what third positionists said and thought about capitalism, just to get a little context on the mentality of the third position's critique of capitalism. First, let's start with a little speech from José Antonio Primo de Rivera.
Cuando hablamos del capitalismo, ya lo sabéis todos, no hablamos de la propiedad. La propiedad privada es lo contrario del capitalismo. La propiedad es la proyección directa del hombre sobre sus cosas. Es un atributo elemental humano. El capitalismo ha ido sustituyendo esta propiedad del hombre por la propiedad del capital, del instrumento técnico de dominación económica. El capitalismo, mediante la competencia terrible y desigual del capital grande contra la propiedad pequeña, ha ido anulando el artesanado, la pequeña industria, la pequeña agricultura. Ha ido colocando todo, y va colocándolo cada vez más, en poder de los grandes trusts, de los grandes grupos bancarios. El capitalismo reduce el final a la misma situación de angustia, a la misma situación infrahumana del hombre desprendido de todos sus atributos, de todo el contenido de su existencia, a los patronos y a los obreros, a los trabajadores y a los empresarios.
Okay, Hitler, we are socialist. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance. And we are determined to destroy this system under all conditions. And lastly, Sir Oswald Mosley.
Africa, like the other poor devils in China, India, and Japan, a great new field for sweatshops to be opened up, so that these new industries which we're creating in Britain today will be destroyed as the old industries were. Simplified, rationalized machinery with a few white surveyors, and then the masses of cheap colored labor torn off the land and taken into the sweatshops to work and labor and cough their guts out with tuberculosis until they too thrown on the scrap heap of the sweatshops. Is that worthy of Britain? Is that to be the future of Europe? And is this competition to be organized within our European brotherhood, bringing in these sweat fields in Africa into our Europe civilization so that the financial power in one European country can use it against the financial power in another? All the great financial central power of the world, now shifted from the city of London to Wall Street, New York, shall be able, on the mass of money, of wealth, and of power which it brings to it, again and again to exert its influence in politics, until, as you see today, it is childish nonsense to say that a British government rules Britain. It's nothing to do with British government or the British people. The government of the world is the financial government, the power of money and of money alone.
Okay, so the sentiment is obvious. Third position is anti-capitalism, and it's also anti-communism, hence the third position. So let's get into some of the historical reality and address the claims. Now, one of the main claims put forth by, quote-unquote left-wing YouTubers is that as socialist revolutions were taking place, big business, high finance became afraid that the socialists may win, so they propped up these fascist organizations to combat the communists and protect high finance. Now, the most obvious rebuttal to that is when we play upon people's common sense. When you look at World War II, it was communism teamed up with capitalism against fascism. Now, if there really was supporting and propping up these fascist organizations, what sense would it make to have international finance come down hard upon countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan, while allowing the USSR to continue to spread westward and to take more European lands into their own domain? It's kind of hard to square that circle. But that aside, how true is it that these organizations were propped up by big finance? Well, not true at all. If we listen to any of the historians on the subject, we will see in Germany, big donations did not start until the early 30s, when it was obvious that the NSDAP was becoming the party of dominance in Germany. If we look at historian and professor at Yale, Henry Ashby Turner, in his book, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler, he says, Hitler was not as yet a major beneficiary of German industry. After weighing all the evidence, we must recognize that the financial subsidies from industry were overwhelmingly directed against the Nazis. The bulk of the funds in the party treasury came from membership dues. Turner says the only election campaign in which big business contributed significant amounts of money to the Nazis was in the 1933 elections, after the Nazis had already assumed power. And to co-sign alongside that, we can look at A.C. Sutton's work, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and we see both German and international, large financing did not start to around 32-33 by any of the large industries. So, typical opportunist, they see something coming into power and they jump on the bandwagon. And we'll go into how that worked out for them. But that is the reality of the situations. None of these organizations were propped up by big finance. In fact, they struggled, were thrown in prisons, were suppressed, weren't allowed to speak, weren't even allowed to be a part of the party at times during their struggle. And it's only of a complete ignorance of the historical reality that the NSDAP went through from 1922 all the way up to 33, where it assumed full power, that these silly accusations can even hold any kind of weight. When you see them struggling to rent out halls, having enough money to rent out halls, when you see the memoirs of people like Otto Dietrich or Joseph Goebbels talking about how the party was literally scraping together funds on a consistent basis. Not to turn this video into completely turning the accusation of Fascism is Capitalism in Decay on its head and pointing out the hypocrisy when we do see pre-revolution funding of the Bolsheviks from bankers like Schiff, German finance as well with Lenin. But let us go to A.C. Sutton one more time for his book Wall Street and the Rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. He quickly says, "We now have gone beyond this evidence to establish a continuing working relationship between Bolshevik banker Olaf Oshberg and the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust Company in New York before, during, and after the Russian Revolution. In Tsar's times, Oshberg, the Morgan agent in Russia and negotiator for Russian loans in the United States, during 1917, Oshberg was financial intermediary for the revolutionaries, and after the revolution, Oshberg became head of the Ruscom Bank, the first Soviet international bank. While Max May, a vice president of the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust, became director and chief of the Ruscom Bank Foreign Department. We have presented documentary evidence of the continuing working relationship between the Guarantee Trust Company and the Bolsheviks. Moreover, there is evidence of transfers of funds from Wall Street bankers to international revolutionary activities. For example, there is the statement, substantiated by a cablegram, by William Boyce Thompson, a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a large stockholder in the Rockefeller-controlled Chase Bank, and a financial associate of the Guggenheims and the Morgans, that he, Thompson, contributed $1 million to the Bolshevik Revolution for propaganda purposes." And we can go on and on and on. That is a book. Both books people should check out. A.C. Sutton, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and Wall Street and the Rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. But yeah, I think you kind of get the point. So it looks like a lot more projecting than actual reality when it comes to the claim of who capitalism was supporting, especially pre-coming into power. Okay, I know what the neolibs who play economic leftists are saying right now. Oh, so what? There was international finance agents involved with Russian banking. What about Hitler?
Hjalmar Schacht. Hitler took power because a big banker named Hjalmar Schacht picked him and said, he's our guy.
Okay, so let's go into the relationship of Hjalmar Schacht and Hitler. First, let us realize Schacht was fired by Hitler. Schacht was put into a concentration camp for plotting against Hitler. From his own words, in his memoirs, Confessions of the Old Wizard by Hjalmar Schacht, "For 7 long years I lived under the shadow of this perpetual menace, without for one moment relinquishing my intention to eliminate Hitler." And he goes on with the big business here, once again from his Confessions of an Old Wizard. "Against this must be realized once and for all that not a single one of the persons thus accused sided with the National Socialist movement prior to July 1st, 1932. I myself had never before that date supported Hitler either in writing or word of mouth." So once again, big business coming in where it's already obvious which way the tides are going. When Hitler finally let Schacht go, he told him, and this is from Adolf Hitler by Tolland, "I have called you in order to hand you your dismissal as president of the Reichsbanks." Schacht took the piece of paper extended to him. "You don't fit into the National Socialist picture," continued Hitler. So that's how he deals with the international banker in his midst. Uses him as long as he can to get whatever. Then when he serves his purpose, when there's no more use of his international connections, you let him know you don't fit the National Socialist picture. Let's get into some of Hitler's personal opinions on him as well real fast. This is all from Table Talk. Here he's talking about purposefully hiding foreign currency from Schacht. He goes, "It was only in 1938 when the war was obviously inevitable that I made publicly known the existence of these reserves. It was clear that the future belligerents would, like ourselves, make the most strenuous efforts to buy up any and everything in the way of raw materials that the world's markets had to offer. Speed, therefore, was essential if we wished to avoid seeing our gold and foreign currency reserves transform suddenly into paper and metal of no value. It was to Funk, I entrusted the task of buying our share of raw materials. In spite of his ability, I felt I could not quite trust Schott in this manner, for I had often seen how his face lit up when he succeeded in swindling somebody out of a 100-mark note, and I feared that in the face of such temptation he would quite probably try his Freemason tricks on me. A little more, and I think this gives you a great example of what Hitler's economic mentality was, and this would probably drive a bunch of lolberts and capitalists crazy. During all these years, I have never allowed the slightest discussion with the finance branch. I have never had a conference with Schott to discover what means were at our disposal. I restricted myself to saying simply, this is what I require, and this is what I must have. I would add, has the mark so far suffered any harm? Is it not retaining its full value, thanks to the authority of the state and its economic principles? You are not here to tell me that such and such project is impracticable. Your job is to provide me the means to make it practicable. A little more. Putting our export trade on a sound footing again was the most valuable service that Schott had rendered us. When it's a question of a bit of sharp practice, Schott is a pearl beyond all price. But if he was ever called upon to show strength of character, he always failed. In these sorts of deals, one Freemason will swindle another. When I dissolved Freemasonry in Germany, Schott immediately turned obstructionist. So we see the general premise of what Hitler thought of Schott. And, once again, he wasn't no international banker that had control over Hitler. In fact, Hitler drove him crazy because you could just see from the mentality, I don't care what you got, you're going to make this happen. And also knew his character was almost non-existent. But once again, when it came to being useful, Hitler got a lot out of him. So he ended his days, shot dead in a concentration camp, and only saved by the defeat of Germany. All right, let's get into the reality of fascist economics. We'll go to Italy here. And mind you, Italy was not like Germany, where Mussolini had total power like Hitler. There was still a constitution and a king, and conservatives and liberals and everything else to deal with. So around 10 years into it, they finally were able to start implementing corporatist policy and making corporatist labor law. We go to Mussolini's Italy, life under the fascist dictatorship, 1915 to 1945, by R.J.B. Bosworth. The corporate state was also the quintessence of totalitarianism by the end of 1933, with the framing of a new law on corporations to be promulgated on the 5th of February 1934. An observer could no longer find any political, economic, and cultural activity which the party did not back, encourage, and control, directing to the farthest sectors of Italian life the hot breath of the fascist spirit. Just how much was the cherished freedom of finance, business, and property being infringed? One organization whose history may help answer this question is the Institute for the Reconstruction of Industry, the IRI. Set up in January 1933. The IRI was created to bail out those banks which had stumbled into deficit because of the world economic crisis. Through its provision of credit, the IRI was soon appointing managers over a wide range of the national economy. That means appointing fascist managers. The companies in its charge included car manufacturers and many banks, as well as those heavy industrial concerns, most closely linked to the preparations for war. The state intervention was initially conceived of as temporary. The temporary soon drifted towards the permanent, however. Adventures abroad ensured that during the second half of the 1930s, the national economic line became autarkic, that is, rigorously protectionist, seeking external trade through barter rather than some arrangement which might have been improved by Adam Smith. IRI can thus be read as an attempt at a totalitarian control over the economy. And a telephone tap did hear Agnelli complaining that through such a body, businessmen would be driven to help the government rather than, as was more meet and proper, being helped by it. So in the corporatist state, business served the state. Period. Just as we see in National Socialist Germany. So let's go to Germany, speaking of that. This is from The Warpath by David Irving once again. In the New Germany, the regimentation of labor had high priority. In April 1933, the government closed down the free trade unions and, 1 year later, transferred their staff, 5 million members and assets, to a monolithic German labor front, the DAF. It was the biggest trades union in the world and one of the most successful. That is what the Italians and Germans did. You'll often hear kvetching about, oh, they killed all the unions. And yes, because unions were susceptible to having agitators ferment discontent. So the countries of Italy and Germany unionized them all. And in Italy under corporatism, any disputes were handled in a meeting between a representative of the employees, a representative of the employers, and a representative of the state. And what was fair was decided upon, and the people moved forward. In Germany, opportunities that never existed for working people under any society was being made in abundance. We'll get into that. And as far as nationalizing the unions, you know who does that today?
China.
Yeah, that's right. All right, let's continue on. Dr. Robert Ley, the stuttering, thick-set party official who controlled the DAF for the next 12 years, certainly deserves a better appraisal from history. A former Great War pilot, he had been lured by a 1925 Hitler speech into resigning a well-paid job as an IG Farben chemist and worked solely for Hitler's cause. In November 1932, Hitler appointed Ley the party's Reich organization's leader. The DAF eventually embraced 30 million members, of whom all but 6 million collective members joined voluntarily. The union regularly received 95% of the subscription dues, an unparalleled expression of the German workers' confidence in the DAF. With this vast wealth, the DAF built for them holiday cruise vessels, housing, shops, hotels, convalescent homes. It financed the Volkswagen factory, Vulcan shipyards, factories in the food industries, and the Bank of German Labor. Oh, this is a little add-on here, a little mentality from Hitler. Hitler's first power base in 1933 was therefore the workers. No history can safely overlook this fact. Among the papers of Walter Huel, the 19-year-old student who shared Hitler's Landsberg imprisonment, he found this doctrine written in Hitler's own spiky hand. They must learn to respect each other and be respected again. The intellectual must respect the manual laborer and vice versa. Neither can exist without the other. From them, both will emerge the new man, the man of the coming Reich. Adolf Hitler, Landsberg, December 18th, 1924. Let's go to the biography on Adolf Hitler by John Toland. Late that November, 39 prominent businessmen signed a letter petitioning Hindenburg to appoint Hitler Chancellor of Germany. These pragmatic men were placing a bet on the NSDAP. They were confident Hitler's socialism was a fraud and that once in power, he would be a tool of capitalism. So let's jump to my video on the Nazi economy, which for some reason you can't put a video fully focused on the Nazi economy to explain it on YouTube. So link in the description to the full video on BitChute. But we'll go to a piece of it here. Let's see how that turned out when they thought he would be a tool of capitalism. And all the quotes used in this section of the video from the Nazi economy are taken from the book Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze. All right, let's go a little bit into how big business fared in Hitler's Germany. Often a slander is fascism is capitalism in decay, or that fascism is authoritarian capitalism. Both are completely ridiculous statements. And let's look at the context and the reality of big business in Hitler's Germany. So continuing from the Wages of Destruction. On Monday, 20th of February, 1933 at 6 p.m., a group of about 25 businessmen were summoned to attend a private meeting in the
villa of Hermann Göring, now acting as president of the Reichstag, and at which Hitler, the Reichschancellor, was to explain his policies. So you get 25 of the bigwigs of Germany all gathered there. Hitler did not take questions from his audience. Believe me, no one was telling him to hurry it up. Nor did he spell out exactly what he expected of the business leaders. Hitler had not come to negotiate. He had come to inform them of his intentions. And his audience can have been left with no doubt Germany's new chancellor planned to put an end to parliamentary democracy. What was clear was that the legitimate authority of the Third Reich proceeded from the top down. It was also clear that many leaders of German business did thrive in this authoritarian atmosphere. Having regulated imports, exports, and domestic price setting, the RWM therefore moved in the spring of 1934 to control the use of business profits. The distribution of profits to shareholders was not to exceed a rate of 6% of capital. Industrial investment would be funded out by the profits not distributed to the shareholders. So they invest back into their own company instead of just paying off CEOs. Accesses by corporate borrowers to the long-term capital market, replenished out of household savings, flourished through the banks. Saving banks and insurance funds would be restricted, reserving these funds for use by the state. For the first time, the Reichsbanks was given the power to define basic reserve requirements and to fully regulate the deployment of private banking assets. The great banks in Berlin were thus saved from nationalization. The evidence suggests, however, that they never really recovered from the damage done to them by the financial crisis of 1931. In a purely commercial terms, the Berlin great banks were among the chief losers of the Nazi economic recovery. Between 1932 and 1939, in which period German output more than doubled, the total assets of Berlin's great banks rose by only 15%. By contrast, the assets of savings banks, were the main vehicle for what one might call the popular liquidity, rose by 102% over the same period. At the same time, the international business of the great banks was sharply curtailed by the collapse of Germany's foreign trade. But contrary to the view that the great banks were the ultimate string pullers of National Socialism, it is hard to think of any other period in modern German history in which these institutions had less influence than in the period between 1933 and 1945. So the big banks definitely weren't too happy with the National Socialist system.
All right, let's wrap it up, at least on the topic on the reality of the fascist economies, whether they were serving business or whether business was serving them. We'll try not to be too autistic and keep this going too much longer because it's a bit redundant. So, from the biography on Adolf Hitler by John Tolland, working conditions were improved with more windows, less crowding, and better washrooms, under the slogan, beautification in every place. All offices and workrooms were kept clean and neat. There were abundant flowers, so that those who labored could also enjoy their surroundings. Such gains were not illusory. Never before had the worker enjoyed such privileges. Strength Through Joy program, initiated by Robert Lay's Labor Front, provided subsidized concerts, theater performances, exhibitions, dances, films, and adult education courses for workers. The most revolutionary project was the subsidized tourism. The humblest laborer and his family could now travel abroad, luxury liners, for undreamed of holidays. The worker sees that we are serious about raising his social position, said Lay. He sees that it is not the so-called educated classes whom we send out as representatives of the new Germany, but himself, the German worker, whom we show to the world. Single-class ships were constructed with employers and white-collar personnel placed on an equal basis with the workers. The spirit of social democracy was what Hitler meant when he told the Reichstag on January 30th, a radical transformation has taken place and has produced results which are democratic in the highest sense of the word, if democracy has a meaning at all. The spirit of equality was even felt in the armed forces. There was far more camaraderie than formerly between officers and enlisted men in regular service, and the elite SS units were models of democracy. Here there was no differentiation between ranks, but a brotherly spirit of all for one and one for all that would have been frowned upon by most British and American officers. Nowhere was egalitarianism more evident than in the youth labor service, where young men and women of all classes between the ages of 17 and 25 were obliged to work for a period as farmhands and laborers for Volk and Vaterland, for people and fatherland. On one final note, because it is topical to today and to this subject in general, and that is the odd case of the Paris Commune. Just as today you see with CHOP or CHAZ, whatever they're calling it now, the autonomous zone, these alleged revolutionaries, which, especially when we're talking about the topic of capitalism and who protects it, you should realize when every single major corporation is enthusiastically supporting you, both in advertisement and donations, just maybe, you're being a useful idiot for international finance, for multinational corporations, for totalitarian neoliberalism. But anyways, as you see in their autonomous zone, they still have to get help to get the porta potties from the state, their barricades built up from the state. They still want medical attention from the state, etc., etc. We had an interesting case well over 100 years ago with the Paris Commune. A lot more violent and bloody, a lot more actually revolutionary. They garnered a part of Paris. And most interestingly, they had the Bank of France, the Rothschild Bank, in their grasps. And, well, that's why it's an odd case. Let's look at it. This is from The Paris Commune, A Revolution in Democracy by Donnie Gluckstein. The Bank of France was privately owned by great financiers and was a key institution of capitalism, as well as the foundation of the state's monetary system. Although the Commune began boldly in the financial field by sequestering the asset of 5 major insurance companies, Billet had asked that the bank should be respected as a private property belonging to the shareholders, and as the state establishment with the right to issue banknotes as currency. He says, "My mission was, above all, to safeguard public confidence, so any thought of violence or pressure was removed." Perhaps such language could be expected from a moderate Proudhonist like Billet. However, his approach was not challenged by Jourde, the left Proudhonist delegate for finances. Jourde summed up his approach like this: "I have come to the Commune to say, don't touch public credit. It is a delicate thing." At the Communal Council, Jourde was accused of speaking like a model cashier, not a minister of finance for the Commune. However, when he offered to resign, it was refused. Failure to seize the bank's asset was a lost opportunity. As in the case of the Bank of France, the Commune held back from exercising its authority over the stock exchange or bourse. After March 18th, businessmen feared the worst and share values plunged by 10% immediately. When the Commune left the stock exchange unmolested, while Versailles mounted a vigorous assault, the stockbrokers' confidence returned. Wasn't that nice of them? Let's go to an essay here. All that the Commune asked for the Bank of France was loans to maintain a balanced budget and a seamless salary payment for the National Guards. The National Guard of Paris was a citizen militia responsible for law enforcement and military defense. As such, during its 72 days, the Commune received 16.7 million francs, 9.4 million assets held in the city's accounts, and 7.3 million actually lent by the bank. At the same time, the people of Versailles received 315 million francs through the network of 74 Bank of France branches. So they're actually taking loans out from the Rothschilds bank while they have it seized, while they could have plundered everything, while they could have crashed the stock market. To sum it up, the Paris Commune of 1871 allowed the Bank of France to finance its enemies. That was the conservative government in Versailles and its army. Even Frederick Engels and Marx were confused by this. Engels said, The hardest thing to understand is certainly the holy awe with which they remained standing respectfully outside the gates of the Bank of France. This was also a serious political mistake. The bank in the hands of the Commune, this would have been worth more than 10,000 hostages. It would have meant the pressure of the whole of the French bourgeoisie on the Versailles government in favor of peace with the Commune. Meanwhile, if you look to what happened to international bankers like the Rothschild family and Warburg family that were in Germany and Europe during the occupation, it's quite a different story, as they were plundered and fled. So yeah, that's the odd case of the Paris Commune, taking out loans from the Rothschilds bank while they could have completely seized it and devastated the stock market as well. But hopefully that'll give clarity to the claim fascism is capitalism in decay, when, as we've seen, there was no big finance funding early party growth in Germany or Italy, nor was there in Britain with the British Union of Fascists, nor was there in Romania with the Iron Guard, nor was there in Spain with the Falange, or in Brazil with the Integralists, or Mexico with the Synarxis, or wherever third position has popped up. You're lucky to get some aristocrats as individuals to support it in its early stages. What the Third Internationale did not realize, couldn't comprehend. That's why they looked for all kinds of excuses and explanations of it's irrational, it's a tool of capitalism. It was simply better.